News at this hour as the Supreme Court rules in favor of black voters in a congressional redistricting case that could impact the voting maps right here in Louisiana. Let's get into it. The ruling orders the creation of a second majority African-American district in Alabama. The decision coincides with a lower court ruling that found a violation of the Voting Rights Act in Alabama. The Supreme Court considered congressional maps in the state that gerrymandered one majority black seat out of 7 districts. Challengers argue those maps did not represent Alabama because 1 in 4 residents are black. The case could weaken changes to the landmark Voting Act's laws, which saw civil rights era rules rolled back in the last decade. Fox 8 political analyst Mike Sherman says it's a surprise decision from a conservative majority that could impact congressional districts in Louisiana.
This case is absolutely going to have an effect on Louisiana. What the Supreme Court has done is upheld decades of precedent that all emanate from the Voting Rights Act, which could result in a second majority-minority congressional district in Louisiana.
Members of Louisiana's Legislative Black Caucus applaud the Supreme Court's ruling knocking down Alabama's redistricting map. They believe the ruling will result in Louisiana forced to add a second black majority district.
I will tell you, we are excited about it. We've not had an opportunity to fully digest it, but we think it is certainly in our favor, and the maps that were presented by the Louisiana Legislative Black Caucus are back in play.
Chief Justice John Roberts and Justice Brett Kavanaugh joined the liberal justices in affirming the ruling. The other 4 conservative justices dissented. Governor John Bel Edwards tweeting at this hour just moments ago after the decision saying, "As I said when I vetoed it, Louisiana's congressional maps violate the Voting Rights Act. Louisiana's voting population is 1/3 black. We know that in compliance with the principles of the Voting Rights Act, Louisiana can and should have a congressional map where 2 of our 6 districts are majority black. Today's decision reaffirms that."